My name is Dr. Alan Detton, and in this lecture I will be going over the bones of the pelvic girdle and lower limb. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to identify the bones of the pelvic girdle, the thigh, the leg, ankle, and foot. You will be able to list and define the major articular and non-articular bone markings of each bone of the lower limb. Additionally, you will be able to distinguish if a bone is from the right or left sides of the lower limb. And lastly, properly use directional terminology to describe the location of the bones within the lower limb. Osteology of the lower limb. The bones of the lower limb have three primary functions. They are going to assist and support locomotion or our ability to voluntarily move around in a bipedal fashion. They are also going to be designed to help support the weight of the body and lastly maintain balance of the body. Now, to facilitate these three roles, there are certain bones that are going to have different functions and have a larger or smaller role in one of those three primary functions of the bones of the lower limb. Now, as we will take a closer look at locomotion in a little bit more detail when we talk about the joints, I want to focus more on the other two functions right now, which is to support the body weight and maintain balance. Now, if we were to take a look at the axial skeleton from an anterior perspective, we could see that that axial skeleton is primarily found within the midline of the body. Now, the center of gravity for the body is going to follow this midline or mid-sagittal plane directly along that axial skeleton inferiorly. So the weight, even though it is distributed throughout the torso or the upper limbs differently, it's eventually going to come back towards that axial skeleton and be supported inferiorly by the lumbar vertebrae. Now, as we can see, the bones of the lower limb are not located in the midline of the body. Therefore, there's going to be a weight transfer that occurs from the midline out laterally away from the median or mid-sagittal plane. And where this is going to occur initially is going to be at a joint known as the sacroiliac joint. And we'll take a closer look at that with the pelvis. But the basic idea is that the weight is going to be transferring from the axial skeleton through the sacrum out to the hip bones bilaterally. And this is going to occur at the junction where the sacrum is going to meet up with the hip bones. Now, the weight transfer is going to continue inferiorly as we start to get into the lower limb through the hip joint. Now, the hip joint itself is going to be located between the hip bones and the femur. And this is going to be a critical weight transferring moment for the weight of our body. Because as we can see, the femur is not directed superiorly and inferiorly in a straight vertical line. It actually angles out laterally and then returns more medially to try to get the weight of the body back to the midline as much as possible. But again, we don't have any bones directly in the midline of the body. Now, the weight transfer is going to continue from the femur through the knee joint to the tibia. Now, the tibia is going to be the weight-bearing bone of the leg. And the leg, despite having two bones, the fibula and the tibia, the only one that really bears any weight is going to be the tibia. So we can see direct contact from the femur down to the tibia, and then that weight would continue carried down through the tibia inferiorly towards the ankle joint. Now, the ankle joint is where the weight transfer is going to occur from the tibia to the bones in the foot. And this is primarily going to occur in a bone known as the talus. And the talus is basically like the keystone of the arch of our foot. So it's going to effectively assist in transferring the weight posteriorly to the calcaneus and then anteriorly through the other metatarsals towards the phalanges in our toes. And what this does is it evenly distributes the weight balance of our entire body evenly throughout the foot. The hip bone is a rather interesting bone because it technically is actually 3 bones that have fused together. Early on in development, these 3 pieces do not actually meet up, and until about age 20, when the bones start to fuse, they're actually still distinguishable independently. However, as an adult, these 3 bones are still identifiable individually, yet there is no visible point of fusion after they have joined together. The 3 different bones forming the hip bone are the superiorly located ilium, the anteriorly located pubis, and the inferiorly located ischium. Another interesting fact about the hip bone is it's also known as the innominate bone, which means unnamed. So technically, by giving it the name innominate, it may have actually just been named. But as it's also named the hip bone, this is just an interesting point of trivia. The point of fusion where these 3 bones meet up is in the cup-like depression that receives the head of the femur, known as the acetabulum. The actual Y-shaped junction of where these bones meet up and fuse is known as the triradiate cartilage. So the 3 spokes are going to aim between the junction of where these bones meet up. Let's now take a closer look at each of these bones individually, beginning with the ilium, the most superior of the 3 bones. The ilium is a broad, flat bone that extends superiorly up above the superior aspect of the acetabulum. So it does form an aspect of this cup-like depression, but the majority of the bone extends up above what we refer to as the hip joint. The portion that extends up like this fan-shaped portion or a wing is known as the ala. The inner aspect of that extension is a smooth depression known as the iliac fossa. On the medial aspect of this extension, there's a roughened area and an ear-shaped area that we call the auricular surface that meets up with the sacrum. At the superior extent of the ala, we're going to see a ridge known as the iliac crest, which can be felt or palpated in majority of individuals. If we followed the iliac crest anteriorly and slightly inferiorly, we're also going to be able to feel or palpate a large prominence anteriorly. This is known as the anterior superior iliac spine, or the ASIS. The ASIS is not only a key landmark for physicians, as it is readily palpated in almost everybody, but it is also going to be a key site of attachment for 2 muscles of the thigh and the inguinal ligament. Let's now take a closer look at the pubis, the most anterior of these 3 bones. If we were to put the hip in anatomical position, we would see that the anterior superior iliac spine is in a straight line with a portion of the pubic bone, or the pubis, known as the pubic tubercle. We see that the pubis is going to form the anterior aspect of the acetabulum, and it's also going to start to enclose a true hole through the hip, known as the obturator foramen. So this bone is going to form the superior aspect of the obturator foramen, while the inferior aspect is going to be formed by the last of the 3 bones, the ischium. The ischium is the posteriorly and inferiorly oriented portion of our hip. The portion that you would actually sit on is known as the ischial tuberosity, a roughened area that is for muscular attachment of the hamstrings in the back of the thigh. We can also see a spike or a spine projecting medially off of the ischium, which is known as the ischial spine. So we see that this forms the inferior aspect of the obturator foramen and the acetabulum. The femur is the largest, the longest, and the heaviest bone in the entire human skeleton. And this bone plays a key role in helping with locomotion by providing large sites of muscle attachment for some of the large gluteal muscles. It's also designed to really effectively distribute the weight throughout the body and help us with balance. Now, the key characteristics that will help us identify is this a right or a left femur are going to just be mirror images of one another. So as I describe structures on the medial side of the bone or the lateral side of the bone, just remember this would be mirrored on the opposite lower limb. So in this case, we're looking at a right femur. Now, perhaps the most distinguishing characteristic of this bone is what we see here, the head of the femur. Now, the head of the femur is going to be directed medially, and it will meet up with the hip bones. Now, as we can see, the surface of the head of the femur is going to be covered with articular cartilage, which is where it meets up with the acetabulum of the hip. Now, on the medial side of the head of the femur, there is a small depression, or a pit, and this is known as the fovea capitis. So again, that will help you with orientation, and that will be directed medially. Now, moving away from the head, if we came inferolaterally, what we're going to find is the next structure is the neck of the femur. Now, the neck is going to be designed in such a way that it can help distribute the weight from the head of the femur and the body supported by that part of this bone down into the shaft or the central portion of this bone. Now, like all long bones, it's going to have this central diaphysis or shaft, with the two ends being more pronounced or robust in appearance. Now, as you can see, there's a difference between the anterior surface of the femur and the posterior surface of the femur. Along the posterior aspect of this bone, we see a delineation known as the linea aspera, and you can even see that this will divide inferiorly. So now we're going to take a closer look at some of the features proximally and distally. So the proximal end of the bone, we can see not only has the head directed medially, but it's going to have some large structures both laterally and posteriorly. And these are going to be known as trochanters. And these are large extensions of bone that are going to be for muscle attachment. Now you can see that the greater trochanter is more laterally positioned and even has a small extension aiming medially back towards the head of the femur. The lesser trochanter is more inferior and more posteriorly directed, and it's often more pyramidal in shape. Now you can see that there is a crest or a ridge of bone between the two trochanters, and that is known as the intertrochanteric crest. So these are going to be sites of muscle attachment of the muscles coming from the gluteal region. Now at the distal end of the bone, what we're going to see is the linea aspera splits, and it's going to have a portion go to both the medial side of the bone and the lateral side of the bone. And this is going to get into an area known as the epicondyles. Epi means on top of, and it will be sitting above the condyle. Now the condyles are going to be these smooth, kind of elongated projections of bone that are positioned inferiorly, and these would sit on top of the tibia. Now you can see that there is a depression between the two condyles. Both on the medial side, we see the medial condyle and the lateral condyle, and we see this depression that will carry all the way from an anterior and inferior perspective to even the more posterior aspect of the bone. And this is known as the intercondylar fossa. And as we look at the shape of the tibia and the tibial plateau, you'll see that there is a piece of bone that projects up into this fossa. So there are a lot of unique characteristics of both the proximal and distal femur that you will need to be able to recognize and identify on this bone in isolation. Unlike the thigh, which only had one bone, the leg actually has two long bones. The more medially oriented tibia on the medial aspect of the leg, and the more laterally oriented fibula. Now, the tibia is going to be the larger of the two bones, and as we look at it more superiorly, we see that this is the only bone of these two that is going to meet at the knee. Now, you may recall that the femur was going to sit on top of the tibia. So it is going to transfer the weight from the knee down through this large bone of the leg directly to the bones at our ankle. Now, the fibula does extend inferiorly and meets up at the ankle with the tibia, and it will provide support laterally at that joint. But at the knee, recall that the only bone articulating of these two with the femur is the tibia. So recall that the tibia is medially oriented and the fibula is laterally oriented. Now, as we look at these two bones superiorly, what we're going to see is that the tibia is going to have two projections of bone known as condyles. And there's a medial condyle and a lateral condyle of the tibia. And you may recall that the femur actually had condyles as well. And where the two condyles meet, this is where the bones articulate to create movement. Now, between the two tibial condyles, we have an extension of bone, known as the intercondylar eminence. Now, if I were to bring back the femur, you would see that it would have a small depression in between its condyles. And remember that this intercondylar eminence from the tibia is going to fit in the intercondylar fossa of the femur. And this is going to be important for the ligaments of the knee, which we will take a closer look later on. Now, the distal end of these bones is going to be a difference in appearance. And what we're going to see is that the tibia is going to have a medial extension of bone known as the medial malleolus, while the fibula is going to have a lateral malleolus. And these two projections of bone are meant to reinforce and strengthen the ankle. But you can see that there is a small depression in the distal end of the tibia that meets up with the fibula. And what we're going to see is that there's an attachment between these two bones inferiorly or distally, as well as proximally or superiorly. Now, at the proximal attachments between these two bones, this is the portion of the fibula known as the head of the fibula. And it's going to be more round in appearance, and it will fit really tight up against the inferior aspect of the lateral condyle of the tibia. Now, the distal end of the fibula is typically going to be more arrow-shaped in appearance or more diamond-shaped. So it'll be important with the fibula to recognize the difference in that appearance of both the proximal end for the head of the fibula as well as the distal end at the lateral malleolus. Now, the last landmarks I want to identify to help you orient yourself when you're looking at a tibia in isolation is the large bump or projection of bone anteriorly and proximally. This is known as the tibial tuberosity, and it's actually going to be the attachment site of the patellar ligament or patellar tendon. So therefore, when the quadriceps contract, it's able to pull through the patella down to the tibia to cause extension of the knee. And you'll see that the tibial tuberosity is going to be sitting above or positioned superior to this sharp ridge of bone on the front of the tibia. And that's known as the tibial crest. And that is going to be where you've often probably hit your shin against something and it hurts really bad because there's actually very little between the skin and the bone itself. So hopefully you're able to orient yourself through identification of the malleoli as well as the tibial plateaus and the tibial tuberosity. There are 7 tarsal bones in the posterior aspect of the foot, and these bones play a key role in distributing the weight from the rest of our body down through the lower limb and evenly distributing that through our foot. They do this by creating a longitudinal arch that connects through the metatarsals to the balls of our feet or towards our toes to help carry that weight back towards our heel. And what we can see if we were to basically look at this from a medial view is that the apex of this arch is the bone known as the talus. So we could think of this as kind of the keystone or the key bone that is responsible for maintaining and supporting that arch and transferring the weight down from the tibia into the rest of the foot. So the first bone that we're going to look at is the talus. So as I mentioned, this is the most superior of all of the tarsal bones, and it's the bone that directly meets up with or articulates with the bones at the ankle, mainly the tibia and the fibula. Now you may notice that this is a nice square-shaped appearance where these bones meet up, and the tibia is going to have an extension that reinforces this joint medially, known as the medial malleolus, while the fibula reinforces this joint laterally at the lateral malleolus. And this is truly our ankle, which allows for both dorsiflexion and plantar flexion of the foot. Now, our foot is also capable of additional movements, and those movements are going to occur in a different position known as the subtalar joint. And this is one of the joints in our foot that is going to allow for rotational types of movement, otherwise known as inversion and eversion. And what we can see is that the talus is going to actually meet up with 2 bones. Anteriorly, it meets up with a small boat-shaped bone known as the navicular. And you may recall that this sounds something like navy, which means ship in Latin. And thus the navicular has this nice, smooth, kind of canoe or boat-shaped appearance, and it's located anterior to the talus. If we were to go inferior to the talus, this would be the location of the large heel bone, known as the calcaneus. And recall that the calcaneal tendon from the posterior calf, also referred to as the Achilles, comes down and attaches to the calcaneus. So you can imagine that weight distribution is going to come inferiorly and posteriorly through the talus down into the calcaneus, or it could come anteriorly through the talus towards the navicular bone. Now, the navicular bone is going to be positioned on the medial aspect of the foot, and we can see that anteriorly it meets up with 3 more of the tarsal bones, and these are known as the cuneiforms. We have a medial cuneiform, an intermediate cuneiform, and a lateral cuneiform. Now, note that those references of medial and lateral are related back to the midline of the body, and even though this is not the most lateral bone in the foot, it is more lateral than the other 2 cuneiforms. And we can see that each cuneiform is going to meet up with its own individual metatarsal. And there is some amount of overlap between these bones where they meet. However, it's more or less a 1-to-1 ratio between these first 3 digits and the 3 cuneiforms. The last of the tarsal bones is the cuboid, and this is the square-shaped bone on the lateral aspect of our foot that meets up with the 4th and the 5th metatarsals. Note that posteriorly the cuboid is also going to be articulating with the calcaneus. So the 7 tarsal bones are designed to help distribute the weight from the rest of our body, and they each have a unique position and orientation that will just be a matter of repetition to understand until you can relate these back to their anatomical position. In addition to the 7 tarsal bones in our foot, more at the heel or articulating at the ankle, we also have 14 additional phalanges, or the small bones in our digits, as well as 5 metatarsals. Now, the metatarsals are going to be numbered beginning medially and working laterally. And the first metatarsal is going to meet up with the bones of the big toe. Now, we would continue progressing laterally with the second metatarsal, the third, the fourth, and ending with the fifth. So the fifth metatarsal is going to be with our small digit, or otherwise known as the pinky, and this would be on the lateral aspect of our foot. And you'll see that there's a difference in appearance of this fifth metatarsal compared to the other metatarsals. And that extension on the lateral aspect of this bone is for muscle attachments from the lateral aspect of our leg. Now, the metatarsals are going to meet up with the phalanges. And what we're going to see is that 4 of the digits, beginning with our second on out through the fifth, are each going to have 3 bones. We have a proximal phalanx, a middle phalanx, and a distal phalanx, meaning that we're going to have articulations between these bones at multiple points. Now, the great toe, or the big toe, otherwise known as the hallux, is going to only have 2 phalanges. So we will have a distal phalanx and a proximal phalanx. Now, what we're going to see as we look at the joints in the foot is that these are going to have specific names. So where the metatarsals meet up with the phalanges is the metatarsophalangeal joint. In the digit itself, between the proximal phalanx and the middle phalanx, this is going to be the proximal interphalangeal joint, while between the middle and distal phalanx will be the distal interphalangeal joint. Now, as you may notice, the hallux, or the great toe, only has 1 joint in between its phalanges. So this is known as the interphalangeal joint. So keep in mind the different joints that will help you remember the movements at these positions in the foot, as well as the different bones that will be found between them in the toes. So recall that there are only 14 phalanges because the great toe does not have a middle phalanx. Also, beginning medially, working laterally is how we number not only the toes, but the metatarsals, beginning with number 1 medially and ending with number 5 laterally.